can a state even sort of ban this?
Right.
And what does that look like? And does the Fourth Amendment cover these sorts of things? Are we recording this right now? Is that a curiosity? Are you?
Yes.
Okay, that's
Exactly.
fine. No, that's fine. But you know, want to make sure that because I am going to disagree in that that's a real big picture scenario.
Right.
Every single challenge that's come since has been about, well, in the big picture, this is fine. Are there ways that we can limit this? Do the states play a role in this? And where is that divide? And what that issue comes down to is a little bit more about, to some extent, some federalism issues about where states' rights intervene with federal rights, and with sort of the pushing of amendments onto the states, and how does that work? It typically, if your argument is correct, it's something that we would typically see really in the southern states. But we're not talking southern states. We're talking about Ohio, we're talking about Pennsylvania, we're talking about Connecticut. We're seeing, the cases that we're seeing now are much more southern. Alabama,
Okay.
Arkansas. But that's a completely different set of circumstances. This is, can we put rules on this? And what's driving a lot of that is politicians in the 70s and 80s are looking at this, and the debate is much larger. And they're saying the people of our state, we've got, 55% of the people of our state are looking for either they're pro-life or pro-choice, or however you want to declare it. We've got to give them something if we want to stay elected. Okay. So what they do is they start making rules, and the Supreme Court has to decide whether or not they can make those rules.
Right, so it's not necessarily like banning abortion, but it's eating away at like the burdens of having an abortion. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily attacking the problem; they're attacking around it, so it makes it more difficult.
Yeah, but anytime you make a law about something that's restrictive, you're making that thing more difficult. So what you've got there is you've got a discrimination sort of issue. The Supreme Court basically says that you can discriminate based on 3 different scrutinies, and that sometimes you get justifiable discrimination, like you can't vote until you're 18 years old. You both seem very competent, but one way or the other, when you're 18, you get to vote. Doesn't make a difference how you feel about it when you're 16. Doesn't matter. They also had the sort of like a medium scrutiny, which is if they felt like that there was a prevailing factor that might exclude. The perfect example of this used to be women in combat in the military units, where they said that the military's position is that women physically could not perform in order to make particularly the special forces groups and the basic infantry groups. And the Department of Defense just turned around on that, and they said, yeah, let's give them a shot. It's not gone particularly well for the women that have tried out. I think all of them washed out of the Ranger School. Most of them washed out of the Marine Corps Basic Infantry Unit. But the Supreme Court said, if there's a compelling interest there, we'll allow that. The third is where you get something like your affirmative action cases, where the court says, okay, what you're doing here is you're righting a previous wrong, but at a certain point, we should have achieved the intended outcome. And when we hit that point, then we need to keep testing this so that we can eventually stop this. Mm-hmm. And so that's why, you look up affirmative action Supreme Court cases and you got a list of mile long. Abortion is odd because it sort of falls outside of that scope. It's, in reality, at its most basic function, it's a service.
Okay.
It should not legally be defined any differently than you getting the oil changed on your car or your car inspected.
Okay.
In North Carolina, we have restrictions on carbon emissions and like different things that your car can do, and so your signal light doesn't work, technically the car can't pass inspection. And what the legislatures that put these rules together argue, because they can't win the morality argument. Roe v. Wade sort of eliminates a lot of it.
Right.
is that they can do this. They can say, within our state, we can control the functions of the service, and that's what makes these cases difficult.
Okay. Thank you. That really describes it well.
People tend to people that stand outside of like Planned Parenthood places and yell at one another and hold signs and do all that sort of stuff on both sides of this get really focused on the morality of this. The morality doesn't matter.
Right.
For government, you have to think about it like it's a service. And when you do, then they can argue that they can regulate services. Now, deep down, do they find the moral interest compelling? Yeah, they sure do. But they know they can't win that argument. And so they always make sure they couch their argument through the issue of services.
Unless Roe v. Wade is overturned, which is a platform now. Like that's a thing people are trying to do.
I don't think that's likely. And the reason that I don't is I think the best shot they had at that was actually with the Rehnquist Court. And even Justice Rehnquist, and he wrote, maybe in Akron, maybe? Is Akron the plurality decision? I pulled it up just so I could see. No, Berger was the head there. Let me make sure I got this right, because I don't want to give you something that's off. Versus Casey. Yeah, Rehnquist is there. And yeah, Rehnquist is so Planned Parenthood versus Casey is a plurality decision, and I think that was probably the court that gave you the best shot. When you think of Supreme Court justices, you can't think of them really in sort of the conservative liberal way. You really have to think of them as strict constitutionalists, loose interpretationists. And the strict constitutionists say if it's in there, we can mess, and if it's not, we don't. And I think you saw some of the mindset of the justification of that, even with the Roberts Court with something like the Affordable Care Act. Roberts said this thing's a tax, and the federal government gets the tax, and so he's in, and he becomes essentially the swing vote on that, despite the fact that he's George W. Bush's nomination. And we see this a lot with so-called conservative chief justices. Nixon thought for sure that he was going to be covered by the court. Reagan thought that Rehnquist was going to be a lot different. I think George W. Bush thought that John Roberts was going to be a lot different, and they just typically aren't. They tend to be much more in line with that sort of strict constructionist, which does not always line up with the conservative mindset. Okay. And they take this job and the precedent of what they're doing very seriously. And you've got a stack of cases, starting with Roe, sort of moving forward. Well, they've created a very sort of tangled web, but one that I think probably to them makes some sense. That, we'll allow for discrimination in these instances, we will not in these instances, and we just sort of keep building off of that. When you take these things as a whole, you can see a little bit of patterning there. Yeah. I don't see anything that tells me that they're unlikely to deviate from that pattern. And in order to basically overturn Roe, they would have to radically deviate from the pattern. Okay. With that being said, the justices are aware of that as well, and so they will continue to offer dissent. So if we challenge Roe, I would not be surprised to see, Kennedy, Sotomayor, Kagan, Ginsburg, traditional liberal justices going with it, Roberts probably going with it, but then a Scalia and a Thomas offering a dissent so that in the future, if they want to challenge, they understand that what they're doing is they're just establishing precedent. Right. So, it wouldn't be a 9-0 ruling against it, but it would be one that would allow the conversation to continue. Okay. But I don't think they would.
Do you think you could talk a little bit about Griswold versus Connecticut, which was in '65?
Yeah.
So before Roe v. Wade, and kind of what precedent of privacy that gave for Roe v. Wade, and maybe it helped the decision later
right.
It did.
So this is the case.
The contraceptives and privacy of your own home, counseling.
Right. This case is famous, not even so much for what it does with, the contraceptives and all that sort of stuff. It's this idea that's sort of pushed forward by Justice Black, that if you take, the 5th, 6th, 8th Amendment, mix it up with the First Amendment a little bit and stir that around, then dash of 14, all of a sudden you get this implied right to privacy. And he sort of says, this is a penumbra and here's how it works, but it's real vague because it doesn't technically exist. It's sort of pulling at these different threads.
It's implied.
Yeah, but the problem with implied things is that there's no rules, and this argument in Griswold has created a lot of different controversies, and it runs the gamut. It runs the gamut from abortion rights to the stuff with the NSA and Operation Prism, the wiretapping, to a couple of years ago they took down an entire Houston drug ring by placing a GPS tracker on the guy's car, and the court said no, he had a right to privacy. And it creates these weird situations where people go, yes, in my own home I do not want the NSA listening to my phone calls, but drug dealers should go to jail. And yes, you should have a right to make a decision about an abortion, but no, I don't want my company to be able to do it. And then we get all these sort of weird things.
Mm-hmm.
The court inadvertently opened a door that it cannot now close.
Right, because of precedent.
Yeah. And when that happened, it caught all of a sudden cases that I don't think it had ever really intended to catch. But they sort of did this. They made their bed and they were going to have to lie in it. And so you see this sort of moving forward with all the cases that you'll have coming. And that's what this is going to be, is exactly, if we have an implied right to privacy, how far does that go? How much does the government get to play in our world? Because in reality, it's a lot.
Right.
Like every single thing in this room has government regulation on it. On all of our clothes, the jewelry you've got on, our computers, this desk, these windows. Government has their hand in all of this. But at a certain point, they have to stop. But where?
Yeah.
And every single time we bring in a new issue, whether it's abortion in the 70s and 80s, or it's email reading today, every time you bring in that new issue, the court has to draw a line. They're never going to draw a hard line, though. And you see that in the decisions, because they don't know how this is going to play out. When the initial NSA stuff comes up, the justices publicly were saying, this is a technology that's only existed for 7-8 years. We can't possibly decide how this is going to go. That's what's sort of pushing them. They're not a forward-thinking institution. They're a much more
traditional.
They'll look over their shoulder quite a bit. Okay, and I think that'll help you kind of understand what Griswold, and then what's coming from these other cases.
Can we move on to Akron
Sure.
versus Akron Center for Reproductive Health?
Yep.
Thank you so much. You're really helping us a lot.
Good. Yeah, and if you've got something more specific that you want me to talk about, just let me know.
Well,
kind of generally
I
doing
do like, and I think that looking at the big picture on how these cases fit into what's coming, because Casey is kind of the last one that I want to touch upon.
Okay.
Because that one seems to be the one that reversed a lot of what Roe v. Wade established.
Right.
So I do like how you're talking about how they fit into the larger picture of these cases and creating kind of a bigger narrative in the courts.
Yeah. I want to get this specifics, because when we talk about this case in AP government, we talk about it sort of in the generic. So basically what was at question here was Akron, Ohio passed a law that put some restrictions on abortions, and it was after the first trimester they must be performed in the hospital. A physician may not perform abortion to an unmarried minor under 15 without obtaining either consent.
24-hour waiting period as well.
Yeah, that'll be in there. You must inform the patient of the status of the pregnancy, and 24-hour waiting period, and then physicians must ensure fetal remains are disposed of in a humane and sanitary manner. And that's actually a quote. Every one of those things the court says is unconstitutional, and they give a variety of reasons. The one that's sort of most interesting isn't even the 24-hour. They actually don't spend a lot of time in the opinion on that. Basically, the gist of their argument is that there's no the state gains nothing by doing that. And if you can't show how the state or the business of this would benefit from that waiting period, then there's no point to it. The one they really spend a lot of time talking about is the status of the pregnancy. And they decided that's unconstitutional because and I'm actually reading off of a Wikipedia page, feel free to edit that out, but the gist of this is that the script ostensibly provided to ensure informed consent was, because they had to basically read this thing, was found to be geared towards influencing the patient to have to choose not to have an abortion. The state may not attempt to influence the patient's choice between an abortion and childbirth. That's the crucial piece, all right? Because a lot of the cases that are coming, including some of the stuff from North Carolina and a lot of the stuff that we're seeing, that's the piece that they said that it's in no interest of the state, one way or the other, whether or not this child is born. And so the script should not push one particular agenda over another. The counter argument to that is it's absolutely in the best interest of the state to see this child is born, because that child becomes a citizen of the state, it becomes a contributing member to the state, it becomes a taxpayer to the state, and that's a viable argument. Now, the court's going to say that no, that's not, and they somewhat address that issue with this, that the state serves no interest in a theoretical person. What that means is that the groundwork for all these cases coming has been laid, and it's actually been laid right here. And so now we're talking about semantics. We're talking about can we change the court's opinion based on the dissent, which is surprisingly O'Connor, but White wrote a dissent, and I think Rehnquist might have written one. If not, he certainly signed it. Let's see. Brennan would have been for it, Blackman would have been for it, Powell would have been for it, Stevens would have definitely been for it, and Berger would have definitely been for it. Yeah, so they'd have been only three probably going against this. Now, Planned Parenthood versus Casey is going to change the way that this looks. Okay. But I think that what I consider to be the crucial part of this thing is that we need to make sure that we understand what the interests of the state are in regards to this. Because remember, you have to keep this in mind, that for the court, we're talking about a service. For the state, we're talking about a service. If you got to kind of keep that focus, because that's the only way you can really present these cases. Arguing morality in court is very, very difficult. You can argue actions and you can argue services. All right. Okay. So you want to talk about Casey?
Let's talk about quickly Webster versus Reproductive Health Services, if you have anything to say on that one.
Not anything that I think that will be overly beneficial to you. Is there a piece of that you want me to talk about? Like, when you're putting this together, is there some part that you're...
No, if you want to talk about Casey, that would be great as well. Because that, it's not within the time frame of what we're doing, but I think that Casey was such a big one, and it's so kind of noted and referenced.
Well, yeah, because based on the time frame, Akron's what, 83?
80, yes. And
83,
then
84? Yeah,
Webster 83. Is 88. The Casey's what, 94?
92.
Okay.
92.
But I still think that it's important enough, and it affects legislation so much today that it's necessary.
Well, because it's really hard to get a report. If you guys stop with Akron and Webster, it changes the sort of the run of this if you don't know that Casey happened.
Right, exactly. That's why I think Casey's like an important piece of this.
So Casey is in 92. Amazingly, you've got a lot of the same people on the court that you had for Akron and Webster. Okay, Rehnquist is now the chief, but White's still there, Blackman's still there, Stevens is still there, Sandra Day O'Connor's still there, Soder's still there, Scalia, Kennedy, and Thomas are the new ones. And in fact, I think this might be Clarence Thomas's first big case. Legally, it's an absolute nightmare. You know the gist of it, but what ends up happening is that the court can't come to a majority decision on this. They've got all kinds of things. In fact, if you break it down, you get a plurality decision, which is Sandra Day O'Connor. Who else is David Soder's on that? Anthony Kennedy's on that, and they write that their sort of position, and they reference the cases that we've talked about. They even talk about things about equality. They reference Brown versus Board. They reference Plessy v. Ferguson. There's all sorts of weird, like, due process clauses, pieces. It's a very sort of complicated thing. they'll reference Akron quite a bit. Then you get this sort of odd set of concurrence dissents that will be almost everybody else. Rehnquist and Scalia each joined the plurality in upholding the parental consent and the informed consent piece and the waiting period laws. However, they did not like all the Roe v. Wade pieces that were referenced back. And they also said that you don't necessarily need the spousal notification. Then Blackmun and Stevens, I want to make sure that I get the other ones, yeah, said that they liked the preservation of Roe v. Wade and the rejection of spousal notification, but they don't like the other three issues, the parental consent and all this sort of stuff. And so what you get is this massive sort of ball of argument. And what looked like it was fairly sewn up when you get after Akron, like, okay, here, we've had some major challenges, unconstitutional. Then we get this piece, which is some similar arguments but presented in a slightly different way, and now all of a sudden we're a little more chaotic. What this did was it allowed states to attempt to create individual sets of rules without a very specific set of guidelines. Some of them have been struck down. Some of the federal district courts have struck down. The appeals courts have struck down, and the courts have not messed with them. Sometimes they do. The problem is that this becomes one of the only issues where we don't have a really good set of guidelines. Like if you start a business and your business begins doing something illegal, we've got court cases that deal with that. Like, we know how this is going to go, and what we have here is not particularly good, and it's not because these things don't hold the same weight. So you'll have appeals courts that will cite Planned Parenthood v. Casey and will push one argument, and then a different appeals circuit will push the opposite argument, citing the exact same case. I think Roberts' court will likely firm up these rules. They've taken a handful of these cases, haven't necessarily ruled on a lot of them yet. They've got them sort of in the queue to be done. I think that they will solidify the rules somewhat. I think they'll allow for some restrictions. I think that particularly on some of the pieces, I'll be interested to see what the one that will really interest me is the parental consent form for a minor.
Yeah, that was a big piece. We met with a gynecologist and talked a lot about that. Because that's really limiting. Yeah, that's a big one.
But technically it falls under that. It can fall under that discriminatory issue, like with a license or with voting. That the court is going to say that at a certain point, and we can base that on age.
That makes sense. I've never thought about it that way.
And if they'll allow for that sort of discrimination, I don't see a reason why they won't allow for this sort of discrimination. It really will sort of depend upon how the justices look at the issue, because they're quite happy with you not being able to get a driver's license until you're 16 years old.
But if you can legally have sex when you're 16, and you can't get an abortion until you're 18 without parent consent.
Right. So that is probably the best challenge piece on that, is the court will say that they've created this sort of unique window of discrimination that can't be accounted for. That this 2-year gap.
If they're going to have an age of consent, they should also have an age of consent for an abortion.
Well, and so all sex and any sort of related activities, contraceptions, abortions, health stuff with gynecologists, any of that sort of stuff, should therefore have to fall probably on the same line, would be my guess. Yeah. And again, people who are concerned that conservative justices won't see that. And I'm not saying that like Scalia and Thomas won't. But for a guy like Roberts, that's 14th Amendment, that's due process, I think he checks that box and says, yeah, that's the way that goes down. Maybe not, but I would be surprised. I think Kennedy would go that way, and that makes it a 5-4 decision at the worst, 6-3 more likely. Yeah. I'm not as concerned about that. The reality is that if they overturn Roe v. Wade, And they just said, look, if states want to, they can stop offering abortions within their borders. That knowledge that that can be done is not going to go away. And so what happens is you create a situation where you have women that are having these procedures done, but they're not being done in any sort of medical environment. They're not a hospital or a Planned Parenthood building or a clinic, any of that sort of stuff. They're being done in private residence, in any of those sorts of ways. I don't think anybody is comfortable with that.
No.
And
maybe that's why Roe v. Wade will not be overturned because of the illegal abortions.
I don't think that if you were a woman that was considering having an abortion and Roe v. Wade had been overturned and you decided that that was what you wanted to do, and there was no hospital that was going to do the procedure for you or clinic or anything like that, then you would go to the old way, whatever that happened to be, whatever horrific manner that happened to be, and that might inadvertently cause your death. And,
right, the hanger method is not a safe one.
Yeah, no, and some of the others, and you can't tell me that the justices don't know that,
right?
And the judges don't know that, and I think that they would likely feel some responsibility they created that situation. I personally think Roe v. Wade's real safe.
Okay.
Because that information is out there, and it's something that still happens. You hear about it periodically, about some poor girl that ended up in the hospital or something like that because she tried to do this herself, and these stories are always tragic. But there's stories that no one wants to feel the responsibility for.
Okay. That's a good point too.
And I think that that's not a secret, that they understand that that's one of the things that's at stake for them.
This process needs to be available so that the alternative doesn't happen.
Because the alternative is so
horrific and violent.
Horrific, not... Even if you were the staunchest... Well, I would like to think I have met some very staunch pro-life advocates. But I think if the choice was, this is going to happen, and it can either go this way or that way, I would like to think that they would not choose, the back alley abortion. Maybe not. Maybe they would. I would hope not, because their argument is
but
that.
In the state's interest, why is the child's life, the theoretical child's life, valued more than like a living mother's life?
Right.
Like, when does that argument ever come into play? Like, if not having safe abortions available is going to harm the mother because she's going to get an abortion anyways.
So the state doesn't want to have that conversation. The reason that the state doesn't want to have that conversation is because of that whole theoretical piece. Because they would have to make a decision about when the child becomes viable or alive or whatever you want to call it. And then you're asking them to pick one over the other. They don't want to do that.
Yeah.
They don't ever want to do that. What the best argument against, for like the staunch pro-life advocate that would be opposed to hospitals and clinics and these sorts of things, I think, is to say, well, if you're concerned about the humanity of a child, you also have to be equally concerned about the humanity of the mother. Because if not, you have that discussion, you have made that judgment. And that's a tough judgment to make. There is an interesting, and where did I see it or hear it? I heard it. This American Life, 2 weeks ago. This is not going to do you any good, and I'm sure you're very tired.
Maybe stop.
Yeah.